My name is Grzegorz Ekiert. I'm a professor of government and director of the Center for European Studies at Harvard, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to August Zaleski Memorial Lecture in Modern Polish History. This lecture was established in 1983 through a generous gift from the estate of August Zaleski's widow, Ewelina Zaleska. And the lecture was designed to focus on modern Polish history from 1795 to the present. This lecture was established in honor of August Zaleski, who was a prominent Polish politician, diplomat, and scholar. He served twice as Poland's Minister of Foreign Affairs and as a president of the Polish government in exile. I'm sure that he will be very delighted with the lecture we have today. Now, this lecture was designed initially to serve as a free space for historians who were censored and silenced by the Polish communist government. It is distressing that 30 years after the collapse of communism, the lecture again returns to its original purpose. The Law and Justice government follows the communist script and weaponizes history in order to use it as a tool for short-term political goals. Historical politics, which is common in many countries around the world, becomes truly toxic when the ruling party steps in and tries to impose its views and punish those who disagree with the official interpretation. Today, we will discuss such a situation with two distinguished historians of Holocaust, whose recent book, Night Without End, conflicted with the official views of the Polish nationalist government. Let me briefly introduce our speakers, and their bios are available, so I will only mention a few things about them. So Professor Barbara Angelkin is a founder and director of the Polish Center of Holocaust Research at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology of the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw. Professor Angelkin has published a number of important work in multiple languages. Some of those include It Is Such a Beautiful and Sunny Day, The Fate of Jews Seeking Refuge in Polish Villages, 1942-1945, The Warsaw Ghetto, The Guide to Polish City, which she co-authored with Jacek Leonciak, which was published by Yale University Press. Along her academic role, she's also serves as a president of the International Auschwitz Council. Professor Jan Grabowski is professor of history at the University of Ottawa. His research focuses on the extermination of Polish Jews, as well as the history of Jewish-Polish relations during the 1939-45 period. He is the author of several important monographs, including Hunt for the Jews, Betrayal and Murder in German-occupied Poland, which was published by Indiana University Press in 2013. That book won the Yad Vashem International Book Prize for 2014. Professor Grabowski has recently completed the project dealing with the involvement of the Polish Blue police during the Holocaust. Back at his university in Ottawa, he is the recipient of the Faculty of Arts Professor of the Year award. And finally, my colleague, Derek Pensler, who is the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History at Harvard, kindly agreed to offer some remarks after the lecture. Professor Pensler approaches modern Jewish history from the transnational and global perspective. His work encompasses a history of Jews in modern West and Central Europe, North America, and Palestine and Israel. His latest book is Theodor Herzl's The Charismatic Leader, which was published last year by Yale University Press. So here are our speakers, and we are going to start with Professor Angelkin. So Barbara, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. This is a great honor to be here. And I will start with few words about the Polish Center for Holocaust Research, which is responsible for the publication, for the book. And I try to share screen. Okay. And so Polish Center for Holocaust Research was established in 2003 as a section of the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology, Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw. And we are involved in a number of fields, academic, educational, and publishing. But our main goal is to conduct the research project. So far, we completed 4 interdisciplinary research projects. But besides these volumes published as the result of this project, we have also other activities. Science 2005, we published the yearbook Holocaust Studies and Material. And we have published so far 16 numbers, and now we are working on 17th. We also published monographs, edited volumes, historical sources. From 2005, the Polish Center for Holocaust Research has published over 40 volumes of various works. We created also the online database concerning all information of the Warsaw Ghetto and Jews hiding on the Aryan side in Warsaw. This is the project which is still ongoing, so we all the time add more information and put more people and events and places to the database. Our last research project was Night Without End, and this 2-volume publication was published in 2018. This complex study is about the Jewish survival strategies in 9 counties in the German-occupied Poland. In English volume, which will be abbreviated and published, I hope, this year later, we have dealing with 8 counties. This chapter are written by 8 authors. Bielsk-Podlaski, County Bielsk-Podlaski is written by me, then Biłgoraj, Alina Skibińska, Bochnia, Dagmara Swałtek-Niwińska, Dębica is written by Tomasz Frydel, Łuków by Jean-Charles Szurek, Nowy Targ by Karolina Panc, Węgrów by Professor Jan Grabowski, and Złoczów by Anna Zapalec. Our aim was to study as much as possible the fate of the Jews in each of these counties, which the main emphasis placed on the time of the liquidation action, as well as on the time of hiding until the liberation. These 2 volumes have 1,100 pages and are based on thousands of documents in many languages, kept in archives in 7 countries. Our estimates are made on this detailed research and 6 years of work on the sources and in the archives. About 20% of Jews who were in hiding survived, but unfortunately more than 50% died. The fate of the rest remains unknown, but we think that most of the rest also died, but we don't have enough data. In this book, we deal with the survival strategies of the Jews, and we describe the Jewish activity and their fight for survival. And we look how they managed to survive. The strategies differs from county to county, and they were dependent on many factors, such as number of inhabitants, the natural condition, the local social and ethnic structure, the number of German occupation force, the presence and the strength of partisan units. For example, the labor camp didn't exist, any labor camp in the Bielsk county, which I described. So there were no such a strategy like survivor in labor camp. And escape abroad were possible mainly in the counties on the south of Poland which were close to the Slovakian border, and then there operated a networks of smugglers between Poland and Slovakia, and it was much easier to escape abroad from Bochnia, Dębica, and mainly Nowy Targ from other counties. We are also dealing with failed strategies. The hiding Jews faced the threat posed by the German police. But the German police sometimes acted out of their own initiative, but mainly the action made by the German police were a reaction to reports and denunciation and information from local residents that the Jews were hiding somewhere. This is not easy to always to determine if the case of murdered Jews were from their own initiative by German police, or the police intervened after receiving the denunciation. Also, many of this murder remain unknown, and we don't know the names of the people who were murdered and who perished during this period. Because for Jewish survivors, they registered and made testimonies, and it was much easier to find information about people who survived. But in the case Jews who died, often in the sources only general reference are made. So in many cases, they remain without name. We are also dealing with, in the book, with the people who helped Jews in hiding. And in this 8 county, 430 people were awarded after the war the Righteous Among the Nation medal. But the number of righteous is, of course, smaller than the number of people who helped. In each of these counties, several dozen people experienced repressions for helping Jews, and 111 were shot by the Germans together with the Jews whom they helped. Some people were sent to the concentration camp, and many never returned. Some others had their farm burned or were arrested for months or several months. The conclusion of our book, of this study, is that there was an enormous variety of survival strategies adopted by Jews hiding on the Aryan side. And these strategies required a lot of strength, determination, activity, and perseverance. Also, for us, very striking and impressive was the scale of mutual help. The Jews offered one to another, and also they created a network of contacts and support between people in hiding. The sad conclusion is that the most of these hiding Jews perished, and their neighbors greatly contributed to their death, mostly deporting them to the Germans, less often murdering them themselves. Thank you.
Okay, so now we move to Professor Grabowski. Jan, please.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Professor Angelkin gave you a brief outline of what exactly our work consisted of and the major findings. Now, my place here will be to try to explain the reaction of the Polish state and to place our book within the context of something that we call Polish history policy, or a national state-sponsored narrative in the matters of the Holocaust. Now, generally other matters too, but our focus will be here on the Holocaust. Now, in the case of Polish state's obsession with the history, and I'm not hesitant to use the word obsession, with the history of the Holocaust, seen as a threatening, let's say, specter on the horizon of national dignity and national identity, the situation is in flux and is very dynamic. Let me share the screen, and I will just show you a few pictures which will speak more than, tell you more than my words. The face that you see here in front of you is one Mr. Czarnek, who is a Minister of Education and Science, however ironic it might sound. So just 2 days ago, he went on record and said that the book that we are discussing today, our book, Dalej jest noc, Night Without End, is to be compared to a Nazi rag. He said, anti-Polish Nazi rag, to be more precise. In Polish, he said, antypolski szmatławiec. And so if you are in doubt, what is the object of our discussion today, as construed and understood by the highest authorities of the Republic of Poland, it is basically a Nazi rag. This is the kind of language we as scholars have to put up with. And if you believe that there is dialogue with the Polish authorities, you need to understand the depth of changes which occurred over the last 5 years, which made words like these words possible from the highest tops of let's say, governmental powers. But of course, this is not the end. This is a graph which I like to show, and if you have seen it, my apologies. If not, few words of comment. So the situation that we see today is not a result of, parachuted people from Mars. It has been brewing for a longer time. I would like you to focus on the blue part of the graph, of the blue lines, which represent, the question is who suffered. It's a result of a poll conducted a few months ago. Who suffered more during World War II? Jews, depicted in blue, both nations equally in orange. Poles suffered more in gray. Now, the most striking part here is this precipitous decline of the blue graph, of the part of the graph. At this stage, what you see is from 1992, the percentage of Poles who actually think that the Jews suffered more declined from 46 to 26. And if you add orange column and gray column, you see that 72% of Polish respondents in 2021 agreed to the statement that Poles suffered equally as Jews or more. So this shows us the depth of a problem. Another little poll from last month, actually, should we charge in court historians who write about Polish complicity in the Holocaust? The answer, yes, I strongly agree, or I agree to some extent, 39%, with 11% of those who are not actually certain how to express their thoughts about it. In other words, you have remember that the question as formulated here does not ask about historians who lie about Polish complicity. It asks about Polish historians who write about Polish complicity. In other words, you have a dramatic situation where 40% of respondents today are ready to send to prison people, or charge in court people who are writing true things about our national past. This is a result of a process which is underway. And now what happens? So very quickly, it is not a process. This Polish state armed itself to the teeth with various tools, some of them legal, which we'll discuss in a moment when we move with Professor Angelkin to discuss the trial, but some of them institutions which have been created in order to enforce this national narrative against which our book is seen as a major transgressor, as a threat. So I'm just listing for your pleasure here, perhaps the most important of them is Institute of National Remembrance. I have been calling for abolition of this organization for years now, hopefully, as you see here, hopefully in the light of pictures like this one, my calls will be more popular than they were before. What you see here is someone who is raising here his right hand in Hitlergruß, in Hitler greeting, and this person has been actually nominated has been nominated the chief of the large branch of the Institute of National Remembrance in February of 2021. Soon after, he was recalled, but this doesn't change the fact that in today's Poland, a nomination of this kind is possible, is imaginable. A ex-neo-Nazi leading Institute of National Remembrance. The reason I am mentioning it is quite simple. Institute of National Remembrance led and is leading a relentless campaign of disparaging studies and hate campaign, mobilizing hate campaign against our authors, co-authors of our study. But this is the one could say partner in dialogue that we would need to have in Poland. Another institution enforcing the national narrative in Poland, Instytut Pileckiego. Also entirely funded by the Polish state. Their preferred idea is to work on the so-called righteous defense, basically stressing the alleged universality of rescuing hand phenomenon, basically that the default position of the Polish nation during the war was to help their Jewish neighbors at the time of need, which is a historical fallacy. Why I'm mentioning Pilecki here too, because just recently they moved also to undermine the quality and the methodology used by the authors of our study. So this is, and in addition to the official institutions of the state involved directly in attacking authors of our study, of our book. By the way, I have to tell you that I did my, let's say, due diligence, and it is really trying to find any other historical work which would have triggered such a reaction of the Polish state is impossible. This is the first one. No other historical study in the history of Polish Republic has ever been vilified to the point of, it's not to complain, it's just to stress the fact. As a historian, I'm noting this fact. Now, in addition to these official organizations, you have the Gongos. The Gongos or the government-sponsored and financed NGOs aligned with the government. In this case, you have the Redoubt of Good Name of Polish Nation organization, which stands behind the lawsuit filed against us. So I could multiply these images. I wanted to bring to you simply the severity of the problem, the acuteness of the situation, the kind of language which can be used to see a historical work created after years of study by a number of eminent and young historians, to be described by the Minister of Science as a Nazi rag is something that simply should place this discussion in its right framework. We are dealing here with an entirely new phenomenon. Things which were impossible not a long time ago are possible now. So I don't want to take too much of our time. We will, with Professor Angelkin, we'll discuss the trial, the issues at hand in a moment. Just to round it up, why this kind of extraordinary violent reaction to our study? Well, the thing is that our study is not actually devoted to Poles. It is devoted, as Professor Angelkin mentioned, to Jewish victims, to their desperate struggle for survival after 1942. But what made our work completely unpalatable to the ruling nationalists was that we went beyond many, we went beyond few or more, majority. We tried to assign certain numbers. We could say that violence against the Jews was not let's say, an area reserved to criminal margins of the Polish society. The nationalists today, they are not involved in Holocaust denial, okay? This is a song of the past. They are involved in something that is called Holocaust distortion, which means that, well, of course, yes, we admit, they say, the Jews were murdered. However, our people, our nation had nothing to do with it. It's the Germans. And if any kind of Pole took any kind of action against the Jews, they were a tiny criminal margin, and they excluded themselves by the same token from our Volksgemeinschaft, from our national community, if you will. So here our book, our studies, well, not only put to question, but basically invalidated a number of national myths which are so dear to the nationalists and which are being filtered into the minds of young Poles through the means of curricula in schools, okay? Because mind you, all these books that Professor Angelkin presented, well, if you were to look at curricula of the Polish schools, practically nothing of it filtered into the school system, and whatever did has been expunged during last 2 or 3 years from it. So we are dealing here with a huge problem, which probably we can address later on. But for the time being, I think I would. So you have the book, you have the problem, you have the atmosphere, and now we go to the trial. We don't want to take too much of your time, so I will now turn the microphone over to my colleague, Professor Angelkin, who will tell a few words about the trial, and then I will continue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will start with Estera Siemiatycka's story, because her story became a pretext for the trial. So Estera Siemiatycka, she was a Jew who fled from the ghetto in the night before the action in November 2nd, 1942. She ran together with her 2-year-old son and sister, and the sister had also 2 small children. They went to the forest and spent, it was November, so they spent in this forest 2 weeks. In the meantime, Estera bought an Ausweis from the local lady, and then, as Marianna Bujalska, she went out of the forest to buy something to eat. During her absence, her sister and the children were captured and handed over to the Germans. They were killed. Estera ran through the forest and reached village Malinowo, 17 kilometers away. She went to see Sołtys, the village elder, Edward Malinowski, and asked him to help her leave for the labor work in Prussia. According to Estera, Sołtys immediately realized that she was a Jewish and took all her belongings from the man with whom she left everything. He also took half of the money she had with her. Later, as agreed, he took her to the German gendarmerie station, reporting that she was Marianna Bujalska, a Pole who had escaped from forced labor. This way, the Sołtys Malinowski saved Estera's life. She was sent to Restenburg, now Kętrzyn, where she became a housekeeper with a German family. She did not have any belongings with her, so she decided to write to Sołtys Malinowski and ask him to send her some clothes, because it was the winter. But unfortunately, in the small village of Malinowo lived more than one Edward Malinowski. There were 2 of them, 2 people with the same name and the first name. And the post office delivered the letter from Estera to the second Edward Malinowski, not the Sołtys, but the young one, the young man lived also in Malinowo. And Estera started a correspondence with this guy, and later they started a trade. At the beginning of 1944, Estera was given a 10-day leave, and having nowhere to go, she decided to visit her business partner, Edward Malinowski, in Malinowo. At the time when she spent in the village, there was a lot of talk about the recent events around the village. And this events was shooting by Germans of a group of Jews who were hiding in the local forest. So it is Edward Malinowski and the forester were denounced them to the German. After a short stay in Malinowo, Estera came back to Restenburg, and she survived the war there. She met a Pole, she remarried, and after the war, her name was Maria Wiśniewska. Few years after the war, in 1948, some residents of the village of Malinowo accused Sołtys Malinowski to the persecutor of collaborating with German during the occupation. He was interrogated and arrested in June 1949. He testified that it was the forester who denounced the hidden Jews to the Germans. But Malinowski admitted during the interrogation and later at the trial that he had organized a raid on Jews on the orders of the Germans. That is, he selected a few men from the village and they went together to the place where the Jews were hiding. They forced them to leave the hideout and led them to the place where the Germans shot them. One of the witnesses who appeared in the main hearing was Maria Wiśniewska, former Estera Siemiatycka. And she testified that during the German occupation, Sołtys Malinowski helped her and saved her life. She didn't mention, during the hearing, she didn't mention the robbery. The court found Sołtys Malinowski innocent. Of course, there were other witnesses of the hearing. The fate of the Jews from the Bielsk County who survived the German occupation outside the Bielsk County was a side note to my text, because I was focused on those who survived on the territory of the county of Bielsk Podlaski. That is why I devoted only 3 sentences to Estera Siemiatycka's story, since she survived the war outside the Bielsk County during the forced labor. And I wrote as follows in the book, and I based this fragment of the text primarily of the testimony that Estera Siemiatycka gave for the Shoah Foundation in 1996. In this testimony, she told in detail how she survived the war and referred to her own testimony on the Sołtys trial. It was this source that I found most reliable for reconstructing the story of Estera Siemiatycka. Only one mistake I did is I mistook 2 Edward Malinowskis. I attributed to the village leader that he was trading with Estera, but he's not. With Estera was trading another Edward Malinowski. This book was published in April 2018, and a year later, in June 2019, together with co-editor of the book, author of another chapter of the book, Professor Grabowski, we were sued by the niece of the late Sołtys Malinowski, Filomena Leszczyńska, for violation of her personal rights. She demanded that we pay her 100,000 zlotys and publish an apology in several newspapers. The lawsuit is supported by the Reduta Dobrego Imienia Foundation, which was presented by Professor Grabowski before. Janek, it's your turn.
Okay, so now Professor Angelkin gave you an overview of the problem, basically of what is at the basis of the lawsuit, and I will try to fast forward what has happened later on. So I have been sued, as you have heard, not as an author. I have been sued as an editor. So in other words, that I did not pay enough attention whether Professor Angelkin or not applied all the methodological skills she should have. Now, the lawsuit on the surface was a normal defamation lawsuit which everybody should or can file whatever they feel their reputation has been somehow, slandered or wounded. In this case, it was not in my, let's say, my country in Canada. This lawsuit, I was told, would never stand even a chance of being processed any further, because it was not Mrs. Leszczyńska's reputation, it was her deceased uncle, but this is beyond, this is not really important. What is important striking is that at the core of the lawsuit, one could quickly see that the lawsuit went much, much further than an attempt to restore the allegedly wounded reputation of the deceased village elder. In the lawsuit, namely, there were statements of difficult and new and strange personal goods and rights, which deserved, according to the lawsuit, a special protection. Among them, a right to national pride or right to national identity. Now, these terms, national pride or national identity, have never been defined in the Polish Civil Code. Now, however, as I had to learn quickly, which is not my domain, of course, it's a legal issue. Nevertheless, in a Polish legal practice, these terms, which can be recognized as deserving of protection in civil litigation, these terms can be expanded. In other words, the usus, the practice, the jurisprudence can expand the number. So in addition to honor or reputation, you can have perhaps one day national pride and national identity, which is actually a goal of various gongos that are involved in these trials. And there are more than, of course, the one that we are discussing right now. Now, the thing is that as you remember, in 2018, the Polish government, under huge international, mostly US pressure, had to step back and withdraw the criminal provisions, and they could not, let's say, go with 3 years imprisonment for people like I or Professor Angelkin. As Mr. Morawiecki, the Polish Prime Minister, said, we are going to have different tools. We are going to use NGOs to pursue civil litigation against people who slander the good name of the Polish nation. And this is exactly what is happening now. So what happens is the lengthy trial, of course, for historians in this case, the goal of the authorities, which are indirectly, let's say, applied in this case, is to introduce not only to penalize researchers, it's to introduce, of course, the atmosphere of chill and freezing atmosphere for younger scholars, but we can discuss it later on in a discussion period. So now the thing is that we move over, let's say, 1.5 years of proceedings. We move into the sentencing bit, into the sentencing part. So Angelkin, would you like to discuss the sentencing, or do you want me to do it?
I can say that the judge sentenced us to apologize to Filomena Leszczyńska for finding that her uncle robbed Estera and was complicit in betraying the Jews to Germans. We have to send her a letter of apology and also to put this letter on our website.
Okay, thank you. And the thing is that why, the question, of course, natural question is, why would you in the United States of America be interested about this obscure trial taking part in obscure corner of Europe? From, let's say, world perspective? Well, the thing is that the sentence, sorry, which still we haven't seen a written part of it. We rely on what we heard in court, during the oral justification of the judge, brought elements which are extraordinarily dangerous for all people involved in the study and in the research of the Holocaust. And I don't even think that the court understood the full implications of this decision. So what happened here, the judge decided that a historian, in this case, Professor Angelkin, cannot formulate a hypothesis if she is faced with two kinds of sources which contradict one another. So if on one hand you have a 1950 deposition, a decision of Polish court declaring village elder innocent, if you have a 1950 deposition of a witness stating something different, and then you have a source from 1990s where the same witness declares that actually the situation looked much different, well, you cannot, said the court, you cannot mount any kind of hypothesis, you are not allowed to do it. Now, the problem is that the credibility of historical sources is not something that a court should or could decide. And this happened here. For instance, my colleague, Professor Angelkin, decided in her, with her experience of decades and decades of historical research, that in this particular issue, a Jewish testimony filed in Free Europe years after her emigration from Poland was more credible than a testimony rendered in court in very, very tense circumstances, which historians can evaluate, but definitely not at the court. Now, this is, we don't have the time. It's now, we are close to our, let's say, close of our time here slated for this presentation. But the problem, of course, goes much deeper. Because in addition to this profound and deep intervention into the tools of our trade, it basically, and here are the question of consequences. Of course, we will file an appeal. However, I would like to tell you that given the atmosphere now in Poland of destruction of the independence of the judiciary, everything is, of course, uncertain. Imagine that one day, actually on the day of when the verdict has been announced, the Minister of Justice, who is at the same time General Prosecutor of Poland, who has enormous power over the judges, as we could see recently, declared with joy in open broadcast that he is thrilled with the sentence, and that the slanderers of Polish nation here have met their due, let's say, reward. Now, if you have the most important person in Poland in terms of system of justice openly advocating or expressing his opinion about this verdict, what does it mean for our appeal? So, of course, these things will be ongoing, but there are very many other problems linked to our trial, which can determine the development and the life of Holocaust research in Poland and beyond. Barbara, would you like to?
No.
Yeah. So I will just finish it here. So what are the short and long-term consequences? Now, I am not a futurologist, so I'm not going to say what will happen. But one thing that does already happen is that people who want to publish in Polish, in Poland, translations or original work, well, now are starting to, about the Holocaust or about any other area which Polish nationalists will come to dislike tomorrow. They have to be advised that they can be now targeted by these militant gongos, which have been weaponized by massive influx of state budget and money in order to make them suffer. So that's one thing. In my personal situation, remember, in my case, in case of Professor Angelkin, we are talking about two very senior historians. Okay, if we are brought through the mud, so to say, here, what message does it send to younger scholars? Where your guess is as good as mine. It's not a difficult one to make. So we can see what will happen later on. Now, I'm not going to let's say get involved in any more of these hypothetical deliberations, but this trial, given the high profile of it, has already had a tremendous impact. I fear that the authorities have already even won a good part of their battle, chilling and freezing the atmosphere. And that might be the initial result. What will happen later on, we'll see. So I don't know if Barbara, if you have anything to add at this stage.
Thank you. No.
So I guess, we said basically in a very, very shorthand writing this about the book, about the study, about the atmosphere, about the trial, and of course we'll be happy to answer your questions.
Okay, thank you so much to both of you. I'm going to make a short announcement before I ask Professor Penzler to offer some comments on this. Now, we are going to run until 12:30, so we have approximately 50 minutes more of the lecture and discussion. And the question and answer part of the webinar is open. So if you have any question, please feel free to pose the question on the website. I will try to do my best to bring as many questions as possible to our speakers, but as you realize, it's a very big audience, and I may not be able to bring all the questions you are asking. So the question part is open, and now let me turn to Professor Penzler.
Well, thank you, Professors Engelking and Grabowski, for your presentations. It's a sobering topic, and as I was listening, and I've been following the controversy over the last months, I've been thinking about, on a global level, the gap between academic inquiry and reckoning on the one hand, and public memory on the other hand, between academic inquiry on one hand and the political echelons on the other, because there are times and places where the gap narrows. I mean, there are times where the academics are beginning to work on, say, the misdeeds of individuals during wartime, and there's resistance, and then eventually public memory, public consciousness doesn't fight against it any longer. So I'm starting with kind of a counterexample and exploring that to then better understand the Polish case. For example, Germany, beginning in the 1970s, you had a process of both top-down and bottom-up change. One could say that the top-down change began as early as Konrad Adenauer's negotiations with David Ben-Gurion over reparations, but then was epitomized by Willy Brandt's famous Kniefall in 1970, and then, but also bottom-up initiatives, educational initiatives, civil society initiatives, so that by the 1980s, there was a kind of new consensus in Germany, although by no means perfect, but that it was, all right to talk about the Holocaust, not only in academic discourse, but in the public as well. A more recent case, and one that's a bit more troubling in the United States, it really took a series of bottom-up initiatives in the wake of the strengthening of the Black Lives Matter movement last year, for a kind of bottom-up process to acknowledge, to get people in the large public to acknowledge what academics have been saying for decades about the nature of racism in American society and racial oppression. And then you have the political echelon kind of jumping on board a little late in the game. And now we have a divided political elite, like a divided American nation, some people acknowledging the extent of America's own dark past, and other people much less willing to do so. But in your case, it seems like in Poland what's happened is that there has been, for some time, and hopefully in the discussion we can talk about the long term of this, a very brave academic elite. Elite's probably the wrong word, because I don't mean to convey elitism, but a rather narrow group of academics who have indeed opened these questions for inquiry about Polish behavior during the Holocaust, but that it hasn't spread out into civil society the way that it might have in another case, in another country. You have the state-funded initiatives to suppress this inquiry, the NGOs that you referred to that mediate between government and civil society to provide the message, not that the Holocaust didn't happen, as you say, but that they weren't responsible. And this makes me ask, the message you're describing, you said several times that this has been disseminated very quickly over the last just like 3 years or so, which leads me to wonder about the relationship between that and the long-term process with which you began, because you showed a graph starting in the 1990s and a kind of steady decline over time. This is not a process of just the last 2 or 3 years. And how do we reconcile the longer term trends that you were discussing at the beginning with the most recent actions of the Law and Justice Party? And then a second point, you talked about this jurisprudential novellum about a right to national identity or a right to national pride. And I'm wondering if you or other scholars have thought about relationship between this and Turkish legislation about the criminal offense of insult to Turkishness, but that being Ottoman legislation originally referred to the, insulting the Sultan himself, the emperor, and even today is largely associated with criticism of Erdogan as opposed to Turkey as such. So I was just wondering if we've thought about that. And then just a few more questions. I want to leave questions, time for lots of questions from the audience. Again, getting back to that question of longue durée or longueur durée. In my graduate seminar yesterday, we were revisiting Jan Gross's Neighbors, a book from 20 years ago. And he ends the book, by the way, on a note of optimism. The president of Poland has issued an apology. There was a state inquiry or a state-sponsored inquiry into the events at Jedwabne. And he believes that we're entering a period of Polish recognition of the past. Now, obviously, things haven't gone that way. And I'm interested in the difference between Gross's own his own optimistic assessment at the end of Neighbors and what's happened. And then just finally, I wanted to ask you a little bit about mechanisms of denial, because I think this is actually the most interesting thing about not your book, but about the controversy surrounding the book. When you talked about the mechanism of denial, not that it didn't happen, but that we weren't responsible, it made me think of a woman of Turkish origin who teaches at the University of Michigan, who wrote a book called Denial of Violence. And it's specifically about Turkish denial of violence against Armenians. But it has relevance for your case as well, because she divides denial into different categories. One of them is we didn't do it. But to put it crudely, it's usually it didn't happen, it wasn't that bad, and it was necessary. And those three notions, it didn't happen, it wasn't that bad, it was necessary, are actually often brought up all at the same time, although they can be mutually contradictory. And I'm wondering if we can think through a bit about the balance between those three and how those balances have changed over time, and particularly in this current moment. And last but not least, I know it's perhaps difficult for you both, having suffered at the hands of the Polish state and the Polish judicial system and Polish society and the media, to think through about the psychological need on the part of so many people in Poland today to deny historical fact. There were Poles in World War II who did very bad things. They were not outliers. They were not bad apples. It was a substantive number. I was talking about this yesterday with my graduate students who raised issues such as the fear of a loss of honor or a demand of recognition because they themselves suffered and they want that recognition. But I also wanted to raise the issue that there seems to be in Poland, particularly in recent past, a particular vulnerability to what one international relations scholar called ontological insecurity, that is simply not knowing who and what you are. And it's often better to get into a cognitive routine, even if you define yourself constantly as a victim, even if you engage in behavior that is politically harmful, but at least you know exactly who and what you are. And a kind of Manichaean view in which if we are not the victim, we must be the perpetrator, right? And that's what I'm trying to understand, because it seems so difficult, and not just for Poles, but for people the world over, to acknowledge that members of their self-defined community, the community to which they are attached, have engaged, and not on occasion, in acts of wrongdoing, that somehow this delegitimizes the identity and the legitimacy of the group as a whole. This is a psychological leap. This is not an empirical one, because the one does not necessarily lead to the other. So this is really not a question for history, it's a question more for psychology, but it's very much on my mind as I've been following your case. Anyway, with that, I'll stop.
Derek, thank you so much for the questions and comment. Now, let me go back to our speakers. Maybe you would like to respond to some of the issues which Professor Pensler raised. I see Barbara raising hand.
Maybe I just a short comment, and thank you for all this question. You made me think a lot about all these problems, but regarding this identity and people who want to become a part of the group which is innocent, I think that this is problem of balance between individual identity and group identity. And because you are uncertain of your individual identity, you feel safer, much safe, if you belong to the innocent group and perfect group, and group which is always as good as possible. And when the group is attacked, your individual identity is attacked also. So maybe this is the problem of education, of psychological education from the one point, and from the second point is the problem of the uncertain time we all live in. So I have no answer, but I think that this is really a very deep psychological question, and there is a lot to think about. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that that the thing is that I mentioned before that certain ideas surrounding national identity. First of all, thank you, Derek, for these questions. They're very pertinent and wide-ranging, so we cannot address many of them. But I fear that it's not a question even of automatic pursuit of innocent identity, that there is a identity project which is steered by the state and its institutions, and it has been steered for a number of years. To go to your initial question, it is a part of a longer trend, of course it is, and this national identity project has been pursued with a different degree of intensity by various governments preceding the current nationalistic government, even the democratic ones before. And here one can say that this so-called defense of the good name of the Polish nation is, I would say, I would risk a hypothesis, a statement that this is the last surviving area where Poles who are deeply politically split nowadays can shake hands, they can meet across political divides, which is not surprising. It is troubling, but it's not surprising. Now, so when you see the trend from the early 21st century to today, this trend is based on a pattern of behaviors. It's mutually feeding, the authorities and the society feeding into the same, I would say, scheme, which is, I would say, very dangerous, very also immature. It's enough to look at societies which tried to cope with their most painful parts of their past through open confrontation. So when my friend, Professor Jan Gross, wrote introduction to all these 20 years ago to neighbors, and I talked with him at length about this, there was the sense of deep optimism that something is really moving, and possibly it was just a little bump on the road. I would hope to be wrong, but given this what we have been saying, I don't think so. Now, your case, of course, Ukraine, Turkey, Russia, to give you examples, go along the same lines. This is very, very similar. The local situation is totally different, but the choices made are very similar, with Ukraine adopting the law against those who slander the good name of Ukrainian fighters for Ukrainian independence, with Russia putting in prison historians who dare to write about the 39-41 complicity, and with the Nazis, with finally Turkey with Article 301 of the notorious of the criminal code. So this is, we are observing, and Poland is, let's say, feeding from Lithuanian examples, Lithuania from Polish examples. So we are dealing with a European-wide and more problem here.
Okay, thank you so much. I have a number of questions, so let me bring some of those questions together and group them in one way or another, so you can then respond to those questions in a moment. So the first set of questions, coming from Anna Popiel and others, deal with the issue of the response of other intellectual and academic circles in Poland. So how much support do you have? Is this something which other academics and other academic discipline scholars are being concerned with? Is this something which you feel that you have enough support within the country? Now, the second set of question is about international ramification. How much support do you get from institutions, organizations from outside of Poland? Is EU involved in? Did you hear anything from European institutions on that issue? So that's the second group. Did Israeli government and some other governments made any statement about the case? Then there is a third set of issues you already alluded to, how similar the Polish attitude toward this case is to the attitude of other countries. Professor Prenzler mentioned Turkey, Russia, and some others. We have a question from Ben Frommer asking about other Central European countries, neighbors of Poland. Are those things being investigated there as well, and what's the reaction of those governments to this? And finally, I would like to ask you a question about specific Polish situation. I was reminded of a quotation from Ryszard Kapuściński, the eminent Polish journalist, who thought about the trap of historical societies, and he said at a certain point the following: in historical societies, the future doesn't arouse the same passion as their history. Historical people are born and living in the history of great fights, divisions, and conflicts. They are like an old war veteran. All he wants to talk about is the big experience of crisis, which carried such a deep emotion that he was never able to forget about. I wonder, what you think about this idea of Poland being this deeply historical society where people are fighting the old historical fights, and what this may mean for future of Poland. So that's the range of questions we have on the table at this point, and we still have an hour to go. So Barbara, please.
Okay, I will start with support in Poland, leaving the rest of the question to Professor Grabowski. But I must say that we have enormous support in Poland and from abroad. And during these difficult weeks, it was really very, very important to us to have such an enormous support and solidarity from all over the world. In Poland, we have a lot of support, of course, from my maternal institution, the Institute of Philosophy and Psychology, and from the Academy of Science itself, and from the Historical Division, Committee of History of Academy of Science, and from Historical Society in Poland. So, and a lot from the Jewish institution, from Rabbi Shudrich, from Museum Polin, from other organizations, B'nai Brit and others, excluding Jewish Historical Institute, which has now a new director. But I have a feeling that the support was very accurate and really gave us a lot of strength to survive all this difficult time. But the problem is that, of course, we live in a bubble, and I must say that our bubble, the individuals and the organization and the societies from our bubble supports us. And of course, we feel this solidarity and this support, but Poland is divided. And this is only the part of the Polish society, so-called our part, liberal democratic part of the society is supporting, is understanding the problem, is seeing the threat behind the process. But of course, this support is only partial in Poland.
So if I can add here briefly, of course, and each and every time I have this opportunity, I always start thanking all our friends in Poland and internationally who have done absolutely tremendous job in addressing, in drawing attention to a case which otherwise would have been completely off the radar. So we are all very grateful. And especially, in our cases, we are visible, but there are other authors who were mentioned by Professor Angelkin before, who don't have this kind of visibility and who deserve exactly the same kind of protection, let's say, or sympathy, not to talk about Polish teachers of history who are going through very difficult times at this stage. So overall, we were thrilled with this powerful reaction. And I would like to hope that, because this is not the end, I mean, the nationalists now in Poland who rule Poland, breaking laws and constitution time and time again, they are not going to go away. The problem is that this kind of challenge for them, it identifies them. Right? So in other words, for them, this is sort of a crusade, you can say. So they will be coming back and back and back, and they have the resources of a big state to do it. So the thing is that we will need this kind of support, not on one-time basis, unfortunately, but it will have to be a commitment, let's say, of international community of scholars and as many people outside of it as possible. Now, turning to Ben Frommer's question about other people. Thank you, Ben, for the question. I know that you were thinking Czech Republic and Slovakia, given your interests. I know that in Slovakia, they have a shadow of an IPN, but nothing comparable to the monster that has been created in Poland. But to be honest, I am more familiar with the situation in the Ukraine, Turkey, Russia, which I discussed briefly, where the Polish, let's say, example, I am pretty certain of the civil litigation tool, blunt tool, will be certainly assessed, because if you are charged as in Poland, journalists are being charged sometimes from Article 133, which is a criminal proceedings. But this is not as elegant, okay? Because if you are accused on the basis of criminal investigation law, you are a victim. Now, if you just are sued by someone in civil litigation, little matters that your life will be preoccupied, that you will spend your resources, time, and life being unable to work academically anymore. But this is not as visible. It's not, you don't have the victim status. So it's actually very convenient for the authoritarian regimes to go this way. And now finally, very quickly about this Kapuściński citation. Well, you said a historical society. I tend here to disagree. A historical society, in my own mind, I would interpret society deeply involved in study of own history, preoccupied with own history. This here we are talking about mythology. You can say a religious society that treats its its history as a form of a set of convenient myths which can be interchanged over time. But otherwise, when you look at the level of our opponents' ignorance, deep belief that they know, combined with utter and deep and profound ignorance, it's flabbergasting.
Thank you. We have a number of other questions. So there is a group of questions asking about issues which are very important for conducting historical work. So there is a number of questions asking about the access to archives. What the situation looks like today? Are you facing difficulties in accessing archives and documents and so on? Then there is a number of questions about restrictions on some American foundations like Fulbright in conducting work and sending scholars to Poland. And finally is the question about funding for various research projects. As someone noted here in this question room, the person thinks that part of the research project you presented in the book was funded by the government foundation. So what the situation looks like now? Are there any restrictions in fundings? Are funding directed to some other type of research and some other academic disciplines and so on?
Okay, so I will start with the archive. In Poland, is the general problem with access to the church archive, because the church archive are private and the owner decides who can go in and look through the archive or who cannot. So we are, from many years, we cannot have access to the church archives, but the state archives are open. Not now, because now it's the lockdown and it's the pandemic time, but generally are open, and we can ask for documents and to wait sometimes. And I have the access, I have everything what I ask in the IPN archive. So I don't have, so far, I don't have problem with the access. I know that Professor Grabowski has some problems. But Janek, you can tell about this.
So very briefly, once again, access to archives, it starts to become problematic in the case of high visibility, let's say, names, so without modesty here. In my case, in provincial archives, I'm touring provincial archives in order to pursue my ongoing project. So it becomes, you can sense that certain files are being withheld, but of course on the basis of, that we have to recount the files, or just a question of bookkeeping and accounting, but visibly the directors of provincial archives, they sense from where the wind is blowing, and that is also a thing which will be determined in the future. And now about the funding for our project, which resulted in the book. Well, it was funded in part by from Canada by Social Science and Humanities Network and the Research Council of Canada, in part by the Polish state agency. But the thing is that still, as of now, the state agency in Poland is very much like in the West. It's still a survivor of the old regime, so to say. It's hands length from the government. It's peer reviewed. So it's not that the government decides. It's other academics who still are doing the choice. So it's not the government in its largesse doling out the money to unpopular and unpleasant topics. It is the peer review process, which probably, as I heard 2 days ago from Minister Czarnek, whom I showed you today, he said in plain words, he said that no more government money will go to slanderers of good name of Polish nation. So we still, as a team, working team, we had partial funding from the Polish side, but it was through peer review under the old rules. So this is the situation. It is according, if we quote the Minister of Science and Education, that's it. An error like this shall not be repeated.
But of course, regarding the funds for other activities like our yearbook or publishing books, from 5 years we don't have money, which before were given to us directly from Ministry of Science or Ministry of Culture. So this is finished with the current government in Poland.
And actually, there's one more thing I wanted to add. In Poland, this is something, as a Canadian scholar, I found mind-boggling. There is a special index of tens of thousands of reviews, and each review carries a number of points. So if you publish an article in a review with 10 points, it's not so good as if you publish an article in a review worth 100 points. Now, who decides? The minister decides how many points these reviews carry. So this way, what the Minister Czarnek, this notorious minister, did was basically shifting the number of points from one to another, and said, lo and behold, you can have some fundamentalist Catholic reviews or obscure reviews. I'm not going to dignify them with even listing them, carrying this huge prize. And this way, you can create yourself new elites. You can create yourself new professors in no time who will publish in completely third or fourth rate reviews. Publications which will be evaluated as absolutely wonderful. So this is the way you can manipulate, steer Polish humanities, and not only humanities, from behind the ministerial desk.
And in this way, the Zagłada Żydów has only 20 points, and the local theological small booklet from Lublin and from Kraśnik has 100 points. This is the last change in this ministry legislation.
And of course, this has serious consequences for the promotion of younger scholars, right? In which newspapers journals they publish, and what's the value, academic value, in the view of government of those articles. Now we have a question from Mr. Plotkin about whether Holocaust studies are here for a special treatment by the nationalist government. Are there other fields like the studies of history during the Stalinist period, or study the history of communist Poland? Are they also being affected by this kind of official narrative, which this kind of tries to shape the views of what things are worth studying, and what is the complicity of Poles in other historical periods?
Janek?
Well, the thing is that once again, we don't have to guess, because there is an individual in Poland. He is his deputy prime minister by the name of Gowin, who went on record last year that we are entirely prepared to respect the independence of science and culture. However, there are certain areas in which Polish reason of state, it's one of those dangerous code words, raison d'etat, has to trump here other values. And for instance, he said this will be Polish-Jewish relations during the time of the Holocaust. So this obsession and paranoia is explained by the fact that to be honest, this is the only part of Polish history which anyone is bothered outside of Poland. And this is why the authorities are so furiously trying to track down and to stamp out possible signs here of criticism and disagreement, because this is the reason we are today at Harvard discussing this issue. Is not because this is the only issue that actually is preoccupying Polish historians, but this is the only one that interests people outside of Poland. So there are other areas, of course, in which the nationalists also are, pursuing their agendas. They, for instance, they want to shift now. They want to add value to Polish extreme right-wing patriotic movements of wartime and post-war time. And this is also very important for them. However, in terms of sources and commitment, I would say it takes second place to what we see here.
Barbara, do you have anything?
I think I have nothing to add to this answer.
Could we pursue this international dimension a little bit further? So, there were a range of questions about what was the Israeli reaction to that, as we know from the previous debacle with the law punishing for statements against the Polish nation. We know that the public opinion in Israel was very active, and of course in the US and so on. Are you seeing this kind of official reactions to the whole situation you are in? And I wonder about Europe, right? Because we mentioned already various international connections, but you didn't explicitly say anything about Europe. So are any organizations of European historians or historians from premier European universities join in criticizing what has been happening to you and criticizing restrictions on academic freedom? So I wonder about that as well.
Of course, there were such organizations like IRA who supported us very strongly. And I may say that I was invited by French ambassador and then by group of 7 ambassadors of European country to Poland. And they gave me their support and their interest, and I realized that they are very, very interested in the whole story, and they are looking very carefully what is happening in Poland around this whole history.
Yeah, well, I would say that in first part of your question, you asked about Israeli reaction. So before I turn to Europe, just a few words about Israel. We received tremendous amount of support from Israeli Academy of Sciences, our colleagues at Yad Vashem, Tel Aviv University, the Historical Association of Israel, and we received their firm commitment and support. And of course, we never received any support from the Israeli government. It's a question of their own history policies they have and their special relationship with Polish nationalists. And you have to remember that in June of 2018, the Premier of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, sat down and signed a joint declaration with Polish Prime Minister Morawiecki, a declaration which, among many other things, said that anti-Semitism, anti-Polonism is equal to anti-Semitism. I mean, this is a kind of prime idiocy, I'm sorry, because anti-Polonism does not exist, okay? It's a fantasy pulled out of thin air of people who think that there is a global conspiracy of people who want to, who hurt Polish nation and Polish state and whatnot, and to make it equal to the most deadly ideology that exists for more than 2,000 years and resulted in 6 million dead Jews a few generations ago is just a measure of desperation of Israeli government seeking allies within the European Union. But let's not go ahead of ourselves. So we received support from as Sir Angelkin said, from various countries, and I must say even from Germany, which I was surprised to see, because for our German colleagues, what we do creates a huge problem, because if you, as they say, shift a part of the blame away from the Germans, what do you do? So they are in a morally very strange situation. So I was very pleasantly surprised to see that even German historical associations lent their support. And not to speak about huge outpour of sympathy from our colleagues who were in France.
In the remaining few minutes, let's move back to academic issues, and I would like to ask you about how do you see the future of Holocaust studies in Poland? What are the most important, issues which still needs to be researched? What is the interest in academia and among younger scholars about Holocaust studies? Do you think that Poland can be, on the map as a very important center of studying, Jewish history and Holocaust? So I wonder what is your thinking now after that experience you had?
I'm still optimistic. I think there is a future for Holocaust studies in Poland, and I see the interest among the young students, among the young scientists. There is a lot of people who want to study Holocaust. And regarding the unresearched areas, I think that the church is still to be researched, but it is very difficult without the church archives. But I think the church attitudes to the Jews and church anti-Semitism before and during the war should be researched, because this was very important in Poland because of their huge role and impact on the people.
Well, I'm usually less optimistic, but that completes this let's say horizon. My huge concern is that what you see in Poland now is a mass production of new historiography run and ordered by the Polish state. You have hundreds of historians who can be moved around by the IPN or by Pilecki Institute or any other organization. Already we see it. They are reassigning these people to study areas of attack. So in IPN, they said they are going to reroute their people. This is not a question of historians choosing their area of work. This is employees of the Polish state being with diplomas in history delegated to produce studies which fulfill the expectations of the ruling nationalists. The same with the Pilecki Institute, now suddenly with enthusiasm throwing themselves at the area which I studied 3 years ago. You can easily guess why. So I'm feared that this kind of renew, and already now you have new reviews being published about Polish-Jewish relations during the Holocaust, published by the IPN. You can also easily guess what is there. It is not an academic review. This is a publication of an institution of the Polish state. So this is my concern on the one hand. On the other hand, the chilling and the freezing atmosphere, it remains to be seen. Whether the young people's enthusiasm, will it carry the day or not? Hopefully, the political situation in Poland one day will return to normalcy. I don't know. I hope it will. But for the time
It will,
being,
definitely, very soon.
Okay, true, yes. And before it does, however, we might still debate the problems that are ours.
Maybe next week, maybe next month.
You are really optimistic.
Yes, I am. I have to be.
Right.
It would be too difficult not to be being optimistic.
Some members of the audience would like to know what are you going to do about the verdict? Are you going to appeal it?
Sure, but we are, as Professor Grabowski said, we are waiting for the written sentence.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I heard that the written sentence has already been rendered yesterday, and we should get it probably today, which means that the process of appeal can be started. However, our lawyers, wonderful people who are working pro bono, they said that this case is quite likely to go all the way up to Strasbourg, the top court of European top court in Strasbourg. So it's possible. So the other thing is that you have to remember that on appeal, if we lose, should we lose, the verdict is final in Poland. And the question is then what we do then, right? Because before in Strasbourg, it can spend years and years. But in the meantime, the sentence is to be executed. And I personally do not want to reveal my decision what I will do, because this is not the place or time. But these choices are important and will have to be made one day.
All right, I'm afraid that we are out of time. So thank you so much for joining us for the Zaleski lecture for 2021. Thank you, Professor Angelkin. Thank you, Professor
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pensler, and thank you all the members of the audience for joining us today. And of course, I invite you to look at our website at the Center for European Studies, because we are discussing a lot of very important things as this one, and it will be in a month to come. So thank you so much, and I will hope to see you very soon.